thank you, Marcus, for your very nice introduction, and thank you to all the speakers who have spoken on incredibly illuminating and interesting topics so far. And of course, thank you to Professor Claudio Mattes and Sadra Foundation for putting on this very illuminating and interesting event that I'm sure many amazing pieces of research will come out of. So thank you for making this happen and bringing us together for this. And particularly, I'd like to thank Kanu Kazao as well for his very interesting talk about late Indic tantric ideas of Tathāgatagarbha and the presence of this term. And I'm going to kind of continue in that inspiration, looking at early Tibetan tantric teachings on luminosity of mind, the natural luminosity of mind, and how this relates to ideas of Tathāgatagarbha, particularly in the early Kagyu tradition. And I just want to mention quickly before I start that when I'm saying early Kagyu tradition, I'm actually referring retroactively. I'm putting that term onto a tradition that didn't really call itself that at the time. So it might be more appropriate to say the early Six Yogas of Naropa tradition in particular. So I'll get started. The natural luminosity of mind, or naturally luminous mind, Chitasya, Prakriti, Prabhasvarata, as you all know, Semki Rangshin Usawa, is a central concept in Buddhist soteriology for articulating the potentiality for Buddhahood for sentient beings across the various traditions of Buddhism. Particularly in Tibetan Buddhist traditions, the notion of natural luminosity and how it relates to the basis, path, and fruit becomes increasingly nuanced and contextually dependent on the specific interpretations of a particular lineage or genre of text. In this paper, I will briefly present a few texts that discuss the concept of natural luminosity, as well as its correlation with ideas of Buddha nature among early Kagyupa texts. These texts represent the formative period of the various affiliated lineage traditions, roughly from the time of Naropa to Dusum Kempa and Jigten Gompo, 11th to 13th centuries. Needless to say, I will be limiting my talk to early Kagyu works and will not be addressing later expressions or debates, let alone how this concept is articulated in other Tibetan traditions, such as Kalachakra or Dzogchen. These writings, which continue to inform the doctrinal parameters of the pedagogical frameworks and yogic programs of the Kagyupa lineages, map the process of systematization and synthesization of both views and practices, as well as sutra and tantra terminology and hermeneutics. This process of distillation is reflected by the teachings on luminosity, which is most commonly topicalized in the context of the Six Yogas of Naropa instructional literature. These foundational teachings are preserved in corpora such as the Drikung Kagyu Chötse Chenmo and the Drukluk Chötse Chenmo, which are both slowly becoming digitized and searchable. Through my research, I have thus been able to search these collections, locating and translating texts that focus on explaining the natural luminosity of mind and natural luminosity. I would thus like to offer some excerpts from these writings that demonstrate the semantic range of luminosity among these early Kagyu writings. So first, just to give a brief overview, I know all of you probably know this already, but just as a reminder, generally among Mahayana literature, natural luminosity refers to the innate purity of mind, generally speaking, which is only temporarily afflicted by defilements, kleshas. Referred to several times in the Pali Canon, perhaps the most well-known quote on the topic is from the Anguttara Nikaya, which I'm sure you all know. The mind, monks, is luminous, but is defiled by adventitious defilements. While this notion of the mind as luminous by nature is present in Nikaya Buddhist traditions, this notion, jumped ahead, sorry guys. While this notion of the mind as luminous by nature is present in the Nikaya Buddhist traditions, this notion was in fact debated by early Buddhists. This has been addressed in Franco's important study of the Spitzer manuscript of the late Kushana period, in which there exists a debate regarding the efficacy of a luminous mind, particularly in terms of the relationship between consciousness and kleshas. For example, how can something luminous be defiled? Why is the luminous mind defiled? Can this undefiled mind be perceived? However, in Mahayana Buddhist sutras and sastras, it is generally accepted that the mind is by nature luminous, and the term came to be associated with central Mahayana concepts such as emptiness and bodhicitta. The most well-known quote that is often cited by Kagyupa authors as well as others is the 8,000-line Prajnaparamita Sutra quote, "The mind is not mind, the nature of mind is luminous." There are pervasive debates as to whether this naturally luminous mind is A, momentary or conditioned, and B, whether it is cataphatic or affirming, referring to something that truly exists. Both hermeneutical debates center on how luminosity relates to ultimate truth and whether teachings on luminosity are considered definitive or nitartha. We will not be able to unpack these debates here, though an awareness of these concerns among Buddhist authors helps to contextualize teachings on the luminous mind and its correlation to Tathāgatagarbha, which has also been subject to similar debates. All right. As for the earliest available Kagyupa works that topicalize natural luminosity, these are most often the 6 Yogas of Naropa instructional literature, as I've already mentioned. While many of the 6 Yogas instructions describe in detail the yogic techniques of the completion stage practices, they are also a crucial resource for understanding the view of luminosity within this tradition. I would like to first share with you an excerpt on natural luminosity from the Kape Chima. Torricelli has argued that this is one of the earliest available texts articulating the 6 Yogas program of Naropa, which can be attributed to Naropa, this text. It's preserved in the Chone and Derge Kanjurs and introduces natural luminosity that reflects the context of the Guhya Samaja teachings on the dissolution process. So just reading it quickly, as for taking luminosity as the path, phenomena are natural luminosity, primordially pure like the sky. The 3 wisdoms, which are completely pure, are possessed of the causes of the 3 appearances, and entering into every object without exception, one will enter luminosity. There is no emptiness, there is not no emptiness. In between is also not apprehended. Just like from a pristine river, fish quickly jump, likewise, from the clear emptiness of everything, the net of illusory manifestations arises and ceases. This early passage first describes all phenomena as naturally luminous, a view that is already present among Mahayana sutras and sastras, and is what is to be realized by the yogin traversing the path, which in the case of the Guhya Samaja tradition culminates in the experience of actual luminosity, or dongi osewa, after the dissolution process which engenders the 3 wisdoms and 3 appearances. Emptiness is thus realized from which illusory appearances arise and cease as all phenomena. This text goes on to describe 5 types of luminosity for the yogin, the first being natural luminosity. In this text, attributed to Milarepa, but preserved in the Marpa Kabum, we can perhaps also consider this among the earliest teachings on luminosity. Or of the 6 Yogas tradition. It's called the Usel Don Shima, the 4 meanings of luminosity. Here is stating, relating to the first luminosity in this 4-fold typology. As for natural luminosity, the inanimate world and the animate world, all phenomena of sights and sounds are not beyond luminosity at all. Since all phenomena are luminous, just as clouds, whether arising, remaining, or dissolving, dissolve into the essence of the sky itself. Similarly, all phenomena, whether arising, arises from luminosity, whether remaining, remains within luminosity, and whether dissolving, dissolves into luminosity. Furthermore, since all phenomena are luminous and empty, whether moving, whether sitting, whether lying, or whether conversing with many people, whether performing other spiritual practices or eating food, whatever you do, it is luminosity. While keeping this in mind that everything is luminosity, practice again and again. This natural luminosity, which is the nature of the mind and all phenomena, is described elsewhere by Marpa as the basis, and is to be taken onto the path by systematically inducing states of what is called semblant luminosity, or pe usawa, through specific tantric techniques. In this tradition, there are path luminosity instructions for waking, sleeping, and in the bardo. But most often, 6 Yogas instructions on luminosity focus on carrying out the completion stage practices at the time of deep sleep. In Naropa's Usel Timuk Dorje Shokdril, or the Vajra scroll of luminosity and delusion, he goes into detail outlining the practice of luminosity of deep sleep, which I was able to recently read with Professor. It is interesting to note in this text, in order to stabilize the practice, he instructs the yogin to practice non-conceptual Mahamudra. If luminosity of sleep is not stable and you have not mastered this luminosity without interruption and you desire to attain stability, focus on the late afternoon sky, which is the meditation of Mahamudra. Refrain from recalling even for an instant the generation stage practices, mantra recitation, and so forth. All Dharma practice with conditioned signs, let alone involving yourself in outer inner activities or virtuous and unvirtuous karma. Whether it is day or night, whether walking, sitting, circling, and so on, whatever is your comportment, if you recall even for an instant or briefest moment any Dharma practice of body, speech, or mind, your samaya will degenerate. Without concentrating, thinking, or deliberating, not meditating or analyzing, resting one's natural mind in meditative equipoise, that is co-emergent wisdom. So here, luminosity Mahamudra practice is thus intended to induce the co-emergent wisdom. In these teachings of the early Six Yogas tradition, one may ask, why is there a focus on luminosity practice of deep sleep? Explanation for this can be found in the subgenre of Six Yogas of Naropa literature known as the Sewa Korsum, or 3 cycles of merging or blending. Marpa's Kabum includes many teachings and pith instructions on merging, as does Jigten Gompo's. In these texts, one is instructed to arouse afflictions and directly apply Six Yogas techniques. For example, in Marpa's Sewe Menak, a yogin is instructed to arouse anger and to merge it with the illusory body in order to transform anger into wisdom. When desire is aroused, it is merged with great bliss through tumo. In this context, one is to merge delusion, timu, with luminosity through sleep yoga. Non-dreaming sleep is essentially the most direct and effective way to induce an experience of dullness or delusion. Marpa mentions in terms of merging ignorance and luminosity, outer merging is like the example of merging with the sky. Inner merging occurs when one knows the nature of mind to be luminous, and in the case of secret merging, there is merging through directly recognizing the outer and inner as one. Through arousing and cultivating on the path luminosity in terms of the essence of non-dual reality, delusion is cut from the root and one is enlightened. Since delusion itself is the nature of luminosity, if delusion is uninterrupted, luminosity is not interrupted. When delusion is unarising and unceasing, there is the unarising and unceasing luminosity. Thus, if the root of unawareness is cut, the wisdom of awareness is attained. These pith instructions are pointing precisely to the tantric notion of taking emotions, including delusion, onto the path. That is, these tantric techniques are intended to directly affect the experience of the non-dual nature of afflictions and the qualities of enlightenment. In this tradition, for Marpa as well as for Jigten Gompo, luminosity is explicitly stated as the Lamgi Ningpo, or the heart of the path of the 6 yogas of Naropa tradition. We must remember through that, though, that these explanations of natural luminosity is in terms of path language. That is, taking luminosity as the path are intended to directly point to the pure aspect of all phenomena in order to inspire awakening and non-dual wisdom. So they're not philosophical texts. In a slightly different context, Gampopa, who what we already know was famous for blending the Kadam tradition with the yogic tradition of Marpa and Mila, his teachings on luminosity as the basis or the view are more nuanced and often rely on Indian scriptures, as is reflected in his Tenshut Lungi Ni'u. This work is dedicated to outlining the view, path, and result. And the naturally luminous mind in this context is described in terms of emptiness. The mind is naturally luminous, is the naturally luminous Dharmadhatu, which is in emptiness. Interestingly, in this text, we have descriptions of natural luminosity that could be considered both affirming and non-affirming, some sources of which we would consider Tathāgatagarbha sources. Among the various excerpts, there is the passage from the Srimala Devi Sutra, which is also preserved in the Sanskrit in the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. So I have to say that this passage, the way that it's written in this text, is not exactly reflective of what we have in the available Sanskrit from the Ratnagotra Vibhaga. But here, the way that Gampopa puts it, or his students at least, the mind is naturally luminous, thus it is called reality, deko nani. Therefore, by means of prajna, that is instantaneous. One is completely and perfectly enlightened to the unexcelled, true, and perfect awakening. So here he's actually equating the natural luminosity of mind. Here he's relating it at least to prajna and reality itself. So here, as Tina addressed yesterday, in many texts of Gampopa, he uses the term thought Dharmakāya. He also often uses the term luminosity Dharmakāya, as she's mentioned, most often in reference to luminosity that arises at the time of death, from what I can tell. This term is also prevalent in the writings of the later Kagyu authors. Gampopa also uses the terms rangrig and rigpe uso, and provides an insightful definition to luminous awareness, which he relates to natural luminosity in his Sungdro. Luminous awareness is luminous not in dependence on anything else to illuminate it. It is natural luminosity. Luminous awareness is not the self-illuminating self-awareness that scholars of Chittamatra maintain. Like a lamp inside the vase, it is naturally luminous. That is, it does not depend on anything else to illuminate it. This natural luminosity is also bliss, however, not like the bliss that is ordinary and contaminated. It is great bliss. It is not the bliss of peace, like the Shravakas maintain. It is the great bliss of non-dual wisdom. That itself is emptiness, but it is not an emptiness that is non-existence from the beginning, or an emptiness that is non-existence after dissolution, or an emptiness that is complete non-existence. It is empty of nature or of an own essence. Gampopa makes a point here to distinguish the natural luminosity of Rigpa from Prakasha, which is usually Selva, or the mind's capacity to illuminate objects of consciousness. Instead, he emphasizes the great bliss of non-dual wisdom and emptiness lacking extremes, but being empty of an own nature as the natural luminosity or the luminous awareness. These are typical descriptions of the naturally luminous mind in Gampopa's teachings. But of course, it depends on context of the text. So that's something for us to really keep in mind. So here in his now we've moved on to Gampopa. Okay, so the naturally luminous mind is most often correlated with the nature of mind or mind itself, semni, for early Kagyu authors. It is considered the basis or shi for the yogic practices of luminosity as well. Here, we're moving on to Jigten Gompo in his Usel Zintap Tempa, where he states, as for luminosity, that mind without beginning, which is non-conceptual and spontaneous, it's called luminosity. That luminosity that is intellectually ascertained is not luminosity. A great yogin said to the Dharma Lord Jigten Gompo, I have ascertained luminosity. He said, in what way was it ascertained? The yogin then said, in a dream, everything was a small white fire in a stupa. Jigten Gompo sarcastically said, oh, so luminosity is a stupa. He then scolded the yogin, saying, the uncontrived luminosity is the luminosity that is the nature of mind, beginningless, unborn, and empty. Everything that dwells in samsara and nirvana is naturally luminous, which is the luminosity to be realized by sentient beings. This luminosity, however, first needs to be pointed out by an authentic teacher in order to carry out such practices of luminosity. To this point, Jigten Gompo states, regarding natural luminosity, the nature of your mind is luminous. However, you do not know that it primordially abides within the Dharmakāya. Thus, an authentic guru points out the luminosity of the basis as the Dharmakāya, which is put into practice. In terms of fruitional language, particularly within the context of tantric Pith Instructions, luminosity is described in terms of the ultimate, Buddhahood, Rigpa, non-dual wisdom, co-emergent wisdom, but perhaps most often from the time of Gampopa to the Dharmakāya. The ultimate or fruitional luminosity, the Drebu Usawa, is the actual luminosity which arises for the yogin at the time of attaining Buddhahood, which is described as the meeting of the mother luminosity and child luminosity of practice. Furthermore, this luminosity, the mother luminosity, or ultimate luminosity, arises actually for all sentient beings at the time of death in this tradition, though generally not recognized. Dusum Kempa states, the luminosity Dharmakāya exists for all beings at the time of death. It is not recognized. Samsara, if it's not recognized, samsara consequently arises. If Dharmakāya luminosity is recognized, one does not enter samsara, and one is not distracted from that state of non-duality. All right, so now we're moving on to more direct correlations with among this literature with the Tathāgatagarbha. So there's well-documented shared semantic range between Buddha nature and natural luminosity of of mind, which has already been addressed by scholars and translators, including Rueg, Brunhosol, and Mattes. As has already been mentioned, both terms focus on the ground or basis for awakening, and thus have shared similar debates among Buddhist scholars over the centuries. These terms, however interpreted, have become deeply embedded in Buddhist soteriology, particularly within the Tibetan Tantric traditions and esoteric lineages. Therefore, it is worth examining how these two terms are related during this formative period. By the 16th century, it is clear that the natural luminosity of mind was regularly taught in correlation to Buddha nature by major Kagyu authors such as the fourth Sharmapa Chodrak Yeshe, seventh Karmapa Chodrak Gyatso, and Tathāgatashi Namgyal. This correlation continues to be maintained by masters of the living tradition of the Kagyu lineages, and according to these Kagyu authors, Buddha nature is precisely the naturally pure and luminous mind. And this natural luminosity, which is equivalent not only with the Dharmadhatu, but also the Dharmakāya and non-dual wisdom, is inherent within all sentient beings as Buddha nature, and if fully recognized, is the source and qualities source for qualities such as the five wisdoms and the Rupakayas manifesting to benefit beings. Here now we have a common source that the Kagyu authors often quote when they're establishing this direct relationship between the luminous mind and Tathāgatagarbha. So the Lankavatara Sutra, which I'm sure you guys are very familiar with, the naturally luminous mind is the virtuous Tathāgatagarbha. While it is indeed the grasping mind of beings, it is free from limitations and non-limitations. So to the best of my knowledge, the Lungi Ni'u is, if authored, or at least orally authored, by Gampopa to his first direct disciples, is the earliest Kagyu reference that explicitly quotes this passage when defining the luminous mind. Chris Jones mentioned that, I'm not sure where he is, he mentioned that it's possible that, that you can actually establish this direct correlation with Tathāgatagarbha and the naturally luminous mind in potentially earlier sources from the Ratnagotrabhaga. So Gampopa himself did give direct quotes from the Ratnagotrabhaga to define luminosity, Dharmakāya. And I believe, Tina, you actually already mentioned this quote yesterday in your talk, so I don't have to go through it again. But just here, just to mention that in defining Dharmakāya luminosity, he quotes the Ratnagotrabhaga with the famous "there is nothing to remove and nothing to be added," which is actually defining the Tathāgatagarbha as the ultimate meaning of emptiness. With Gampopa and indeed Jigten Gompo, both of whom are well known as eclectic masters who overtly attempted to blend sutric and tantric teachings and terminology, there is both indirect and direct references to how the basis luminosity of the naturally luminous mind is inseparable or no different from the ultimate or fruitional luminosity that arises at the time of enlightenment. Why is this so? Because they are both of the nature of the Dharmakāya in accordance with the Ratnagotrabhaga teachings. To this point, and to how the luminosity of the path relates to the basis and fruition, I would like to end by sharing Jigten Gompo's description in his fivefold luminosity scheme, which, although not explicit, is clearly influenced by Tathāgatagarbha literature or terminology. First, one's true mind is luminosity, neither coming nor going, abiding primordially as the birthless Dharmakāya, free from adventitious defilements. For example, a lotus, although born from mud, is not tainted by mud, or gold is not tainted by tarnish. Since it is not known that it is this way, one is unaware or ignorant of the delusion regarding reality. On account of this, there is attachment to beauty and aversion to ugliness. Since ignorance has produced the basis for those inclinations, one wrongly perceives cause and effect. Thus, one roams in cyclic existence that is the ocean of suffering, unaware or ignorant of delusion regarding karma, cause, and effect. Second, regarding the luminosity of the path, it is the method for realizing what is the basis. Having been pointed out by a genuine guru, that introduction is like meeting someone who is already familiar. In terms of the resolve that one's mind is the Dharmakāya, the recognition of oneself by oneself, one practices with regards to the basis. Through this, all thoughts of attachment and aversion in the day are like snow falling on heated rocks, and one realizes the lack of inherent nature or awareness that is untainted by stains, being stripped naked like a clear lump of crystal. Third, regarding the luminosity of dream, through calling the virtuous practice of the day during the depths of sleep, the illusion of sleep and dream are purified in their own place, and the virtuous practice of the day and the luminosity of the night are mixed into one, like water poured into water or butter poured into butter. Fourth, regarding the luminosity of the bardo, the luminosity of day and night are mixed into one, and along with the luminosity of the bardo, the three are mixed into one. After the illusory display of the 6 realms of the bardo and so forth are purified, the luminosities of mother and child are mixed into one, like a stream uniting with the ocean. Fifth, regarding the ultimate luminosity, after arriving in terms of the true luminosity of the basis, the meaning of the Dharmakāya as neither coming nor going is realized. Thus, the Rupakāya appears to the perception of others, transforming into beneficial action for any sentient being who is to be tamed. For example, it is like after drawing a precious jewel from the mud, then washing it 3 times, wiping it 3 times, and so forth, it becomes all that is needed and desired, and like gold free of tarnish, it is able to fulfill its function. This is the Pith Instruction of merging 5 luminosities into one. While explicit correlations made between Tathāgatagarbha and the natural luminosity of mind are rare among early Kagyu writings on luminosity or natural luminosity, the semantic overlap and shared terminology and descriptions are made clear in this passage. More often, though, natural luminosity or basis luminosity is explained in terms of defining semni, or the nature of mind, as the basis for the practice and Buddhahood. Rather than an exhaustive map, I have only provided a cursory sketch of the natural luminosity and its correlations to Tathāgatagarbha among the Kagyu writings. As more texts and collections become available and easily searchable, I hope to provide more comprehensive study on the semantic relationship between these 2 terms in this specific context. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Casey, for guiding us through the trajectory of the development of this term vessel in early Kagyu literature. We have enough time for questions, so go ahead.
Going back to that Gampopa quote from the Yin Silky Mailon. It was the one about when it was comparing the idea of this one. I think there's just a small correction to be made because it says Sensambu Shekara Ramri Gumsel Dindandu Kudba Tabumayente, so it's not like the self-aware, self-luminous cognition that's claimed to be ultimate.
Yes.
Of the sense on it.
Yes, thank you. No, I appreciate that. It makes a big difference.
Yeah, George, please.
I was wondering in your sources whether the authors, because you read more than one author, whether there is an explicit equation of yourself with Tathāgatagarbha. Or you just assume that, okay, wherever yourself is, it is also Tathāgatagarbha.
So, as I mentioned in the Lungi Ni'u, which is here, so this is actually, I didn't actually include it on the slide, but this passage from the Lankavatara that equates this is actually used in his description of the luminous mind as emptiness. So he basically samples a series of Indian tantric literature, sources from Indian tantric literature and non-tantric, and he includes this among his sources. So that's one place I've seen it, a direct correlation in the early literature, but besides that, the closest thing I found in these early sources, I think Tina mentioned that some of Gampopa's direct disciples did make that direct correlation though. Yes. So yeah, but among the sources I looked at, the closest I could find essentially was this this teaching from Jigten Gompo, where he uses the fourth simile of the gold and the tarnish. So
I understand correctly, the Gampopa himself explicitly explicitly doesn't equate, but his students equate. Yeah.
Mhm.
I found in Nikidorje, when he's critiquing Godatsawa's views, he actually says Yesheg Ningpo and or sometimes or
Yes.
Ramjin itself, so they're
Yes.
taken as quasi-synonyms by the
Yes.
time.
Yeah, and Dagpo Shinamgil does that as well, and yeah.
They became treated as synonyms.
Yes. That's kind of-
It was interesting for me. You have shown us the passage with Stupa.
Oh, yes.
Could you explain a bit more about that?
I think it was just, I think it was a refutation of Jigten Gampo saying, okay, this is not actually an appearance, it's not something you can actually see, it's not a light, it's not an actual appearance when we're talking about the natural luminosity to be realized in this context. Okay. It's always the danger of putting the Wiley up, right? Everyone wants to retranslate. It's too tempting, I know. Yes?
I'm wondering about the luminosity of, or the yoga of luminosity within this set of 6.
Yes.
Because it doesn't seem like a natural set to me of these 6 yogas in a row, but like kind of pulled together. Because other kind of different kind of stage yoga, you have like 8-fold yoga or 6-fold other like. So I'm wondering, does it have a special place? Do you see it as having a special place, or kind of pull, like the history of this collection
Yeah.
of 6?
I'm hesitant to give you my theories, but I mean, usually they're pretty ordered. So you usually see it coming after the gyulu. So and the gyulu practices are intended generally from what I read, and this is very huge generalizations, but to kind of help the yogi realize the illusory nature of all phenomena, and then you move on to the luminosity practices. So and then usually after that, I think it's the Bardo practices that are taught after that, if I'm correct. So there is kind of a progressive, there are yogas to be completed, it looks like, in progressive stages, and they tend to be ordered.
But doesn't this yoga of luminosity kind of free float, like outside of this?
Well, sometimes in some of these descriptions, it depends on which author and which text. The ones that I've read, it looks like oftentimes all of the yogas basically are intended to induce the state of luminosity or get you familiar with the semblant luminosity through practice. But the one that's actually called the yoga of luminosity in this context is in relation to sleep, which is to be induced through this kind of delusory state, or the timuk state that occurs in deep sleep. And that's from the earliest teachings of Marpa, really talking about this merging idea, that's where, in terms of the poisons, that's really how you can kind of foster, cultivate the practice itself. So it's deep sleep yoga, essentially.
Well, just on the deep sleep, and then I'll ask my question. I think that goes back all over the Upanishads, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the deepest state of consciousness that's luminous is
Mm-hmm.
non-dreaming sleep.
Yes, I'm not aware, but
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that's very, not that I'm going to trace that, but just as a reference to look at.
mm-hmm.
But my question is about kind of, do you find descriptions of phenomena emerging within the mind, descriptions of imagery of any
Mhm.
kind that emerges within this book?
No, unfortunately. I mean, there's nothing that I've come across personally, but I'm
So it's
focusing,
non-phenomenological.
not that I have come across.
That whole discussion now seems to go into the direction that you said is used in so many different
Yes,
texts.
yes.
So I think you were trying to bring out more or less its affinity with Buddha nature in one way or the
Mm-hmm.
other.
Mm-hmm.
And the other considerations now rather about the method,
Mm-hmm.
which is probably something else.
Mm-hmm.
I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I think one has to be clear about the context.
Yes, the context is incredibly important. Yeah. I think the point is, though, that luminosity being topicalized in the kind of earliest sources that we have available during this kind of transition process, or as kind of the late tantric tradition is being received into Tibet, particularly in the Kagyu lineage systems, that you basically, the primary texts that you have that topicalize it are these tantric instructional literatures. So you have embedded within these instructions, you actually have kind of these descriptions and typologies and kind of definitions essentially coming out, and that's really where you start finding it kind of becoming increasingly topicalized. And then, of course, by the 15th century, you really have these dedicated teachings to luminosity, more from a kind of Mahayana perspective or a philosophical perspective. But to look at kind of the earliest sources from the yogic tradition, at least, of the Kagyu, it's really, this is where you find kind of talking about the natural luminosity and how it kind of fits into the practice tradition. Why are we talking about it? What are we using it for? Why are we bringing it about? And so yeah.
So now, Carol, I have you. This, of course, I don't know the textual the situation of your textual situation, but this God domain, you understand as fire, but I have a little bit of a suspicion.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what other scholars think about it.
Yeah.
So this Chetan God domain, I have a feeling it's kind of an adverbial sort of a construction, and not necessarily fire, but I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I've consulted with some. People.
Maybe you have parallel source or some other source.
I just consulted with some Kempo, so yeah.
You referred, or it seems like that you focus on the 6 dharmas of Naropa mainly, in your quotes. But as this is a tradition coming from Marpa, certainly to me it appears that in these explanations there is so much of the Maitripa Mahamudra included as to explain the different, as a commentary to the yoga practices. What do you think?
Yes, definitely. In these early teachings, Maitripa is not explicitly discussed, and so I've been researching and trying to find explicit teachings that topicalize luminosity, and I haven't seen any direct references, but I'm sure Professor Mattis's research has really looked into that quite in depth. So I would refer you to his research.
Well, luminosity plays a big role in the works of Maitripa.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
The dharmas or phenomena are said to be luminous.
Yes.
And, emptiness sometimes is equated with luminosity.
Yes. So it's pretty consistent, yeah.
Perhaps I might ask a question. So I was wondering, in the way you were presenting these sources, right? It seemed there's a straightforward historical development, right? You're starting from Naropa, Marpa, Gampopa, and then I was wondering, kind of, when we look on the actual contents and the textual levels, is that true? Are these texts and how this concept is explained? Is there this clear historical development?
I would not say that. No, I did that for just kind of convenience for all of us to kind of go through it and kind of explore the development together. There's not explicitly saying, okay, let's say the 5 types of luminosity that Jigten Gompo discusses was explicitly said to have come from Marpa's, like he has a 4-fold luminosity, which is quite similar. It's not explicitly stated, but you see kind of the increasing topicalization of the concept, and definitely if you look at it in terms of the corpora, you see as you get into the later authors that it becomes more of a kind of conscious topic of text, and so that's something to be observed, but it's just kind of giving a kind of brief sketch of different relevant teachings in the early tradition. It wasn't intended to infer a direct self-conscious link, at least. So.
We still have time, for 1 or 2 short questions. Douglas?
Just a minor point on the Gampopa quote where you say, if you could pull it up, you say it's the instantaneous mind. Let's see.
This one?
Yes. I'm wondering why you say it's instantaneous when it's the gejikmatang dendashira, like or momentary. I was thinking. I think instantaneous suggests like coming, like immediate, whereas kind of momentary.
In a single moment, yeah.
Yeah.
In a single moment.
It was just a minor suggestion. Since you put up the wide.
Yeah. I know. Just asking for trouble.
But I think it's just in light of his.
Yeah.
You know, it's not this static. You know, the wisdom is also momentary.
Yes.
Well, I think it is a significant.
Yeah. I wish I could pull up the quote from the Dharmakāya. I can't here, so yeah. Yeah, it's that single instant. Yeah.
David, you had another question.
I may have already forgotten. Sorry, that time of the day.
All right.
All right.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.